Yeah, I mean, the class character is important, and as I said before, non-accidental. But I wonder if the trap that critical race theorists found themselves in, or at least the trap I think they fell in, with respect to the critique of political economy, is not it's not just as easy as to say, well, they needed something else to talk about. They did, but it was a little more subtle than that. So I think that what happened earlier than them and happened outside of the context of any middle class, even the black middle class in the United States. One of the things that happens to Marxism, I mean, really early on, I'm talking the 1890s, the end of the 1890s, is that people start to challenge its political economic presuppositions. And they try to replace the critique of value, that is, which ends up with a theory of capitalism that sees capitalist production of profit as constantly undermining itself through the constant renewal of the means of production, and therefore ending up in crises. They see that theory as having run up against a historical wall. So you can say Bernstein does this in the 1899 in Preconditions of Socialism. He'll just say, look, this whole dialectical model thing, it's just not working out for us. What we really need is a theory of why capitalism stays put. And then this is echoed again by Friedrich Pollock after the Russian Revolution, saying essentially we've moved on to a post-capitalist phase, one that's done with crises anyway. And so we really need to replace this political economic part of Marxism, preserve its method, and throw out its conclusions. People often cite a Lukács essay called, what is it called? What is orthodoxy or something? It's the beginning of that 1923 History and Class Consciousness book, to be able to make this distinction between method and theoretical conclusion. Now, what happens with CRT is one of the many, many ways that people come to replace the critique of value with some other critique. So instead of talking about value, we'll talk about race. And in fact, sometimes it's really comical, at least it's comical to me, if you look at it through these lenses, where some of these especially in that larger body of critical race theory, they'll quote Marx word for word, but replace all the economic terms with race. So there you can see the conceptual move, and that can rope people in who are not particularly interested in supporting any class, or who might. I mean, it can rope well-meaning Marxists in. If you already want to throw overboard the theory of value.
Pascal, do you want to add something there?
No, I mean, I'd like to, let's get into the subject matter in terms of where this theory comes from. Exactly. Can you trace the actual history of critical race theory in terms of where it gets its origins from and where it stems from in terms of its foundations?
Yeah, so it's a species of something else. Initially it's a species of something called critical legal studies. The word critical there is really important. You see critical all the time these days. You'll see, so we have to ask the question, what did critical legal studies, what is critical race theory, what is critical theory, of which both of them are examples? What's critical about it, and what on earth is the opposite of critical? Like, uncritical? Okay, well, that's a good question. The answer is that the opposite of critical is traditional. And so in the first formulation of this distinction, which comes about really right after World War II in the context of the Frankfurt School, when Max Horkheimer takes over from his Marxist predecessors and reorients the Frankfurt School away from political economy, giants like Heinrich Grossman, who's really getting his day in the sun these days, and toward more cultural analyses. When Horkheimer takes over, he gives an inaugural address. And in that inaugural address, he makes a distinction between traditional theory and critical theory. Now, the distinction he's trying to make, and there has details, but the thing I want to highlight about it is that traditional is a slur. That is, traditional is meant to say merely traditional, the authority of tradition, of patriarchy, of received opinion, that which we inherit unthinkingly. That's what he means by traditional. That's traditional theory. Critical theory is this next form of self-conscious theory that has been sufficiently, set to, knows its own preconditions. Traditional theory is what? He takes it to be paradigmatically, Kantian epistemology, in which, there's logic and there's a set of concepts that have some role to play in the objectivity of the world. And we can have theories about the world, and those theories reflect the world, and they're very powerful because they allow us to manipulate the world. So you can think of the success of physics, right? On the other hand, he wants to counterpose critical theory. Now, critical theory is going to be, going to always know that concepts are dialectical, that they're in motion, that there's a historical process to their development and their coming to be, and they're self-undermining, and that's what we ought to be tracking. Now, when it comes to legal studies, what do they mean by critical? Well, critical there means adopting the method of Marxism, the dialectical method that had been introduced, that had been separated from its political economic conclusions by Horkheimer and et cetera, and now applied to a new realm. So in the critical legal studies framework, it would be, well, look, the legal system is just a superstructure for a war of powers on the ground. That's the legal realist presupposition that the critical legal studies, let's say, cadre, came up with. And so in critical legal studies, that's what they meant by critical. That they were looking underneath the surface of society and seeing the play of objective forces underneath. So critical race theory is just a particular version of that. So as you peel away the surface, underneath you see the dynamic of race, which is self-perpetuating, which is always there for racial, to reproduce, that classic Marxian term, to reproduce racial oppression, rather than exploitation, right? In fact, they say exploitation is there in order to forward racial oppression rather than the other way around. Anyway, that's where it originates. It's in the 1970s that CLS gets going, that is critical legal studies gets going. Critical race theory emerges after that. It's really a product of the 1980s. Think the Reagan era.
Would you say it's neoliberal in nature or no?
It's I got to tell you, I don't love the word neoliberal. If only because I don't know exactly what it means. And if what it means is the ideology that backs up governments retreating from investment in public works and endorsing market solutions. So let's say Pinochet's neoliberalism, that's what it's cued around. That period is over anyway. We're all about public investments in things now, and whether it was ever true in a society like ours, which is so tied to military investments, is another question. I also think that people reach for the word neoliberalism when they really mean the word capitalism, and I'd rather be anti-capitalist than anti-neoliberal. But that it's coterminous with neoliberalism and part of the same cultural moment, I think, is totally without doubt.
Do you have a problem with the notion that there's a specific period of time, particularly in the 70s, when the nature of capitalism in America exacerbates to become more cannibalistic?
Absolutely. Well, what happens? What happens is that you get an endemic profitability crisis. So if you look at anyone's numbers, you look at Michael Roberts' numbers, you look at Andrew Kleinman's numbers. I mean, you may or may not like any of these political economists, contemporary Marxian political economists, but everyone agrees that from roughly the beginning of U.S. industrialism after the war, to the 1970s, to basically 1973, there's a profitability boom. That profitability boom comes to a decisive close, and there need to be policy solutions in order to stave off what will become an economic crisis. And so they try to privatize the economy. They try to crush the power of labor. And one of the most effective ways of crushing the power of labor, of course, is splitting it off from itself, right? Trying to get workers not to solidarize with other workers in terms of their economic position. And a new ideology of race is, of course, part of that. We see it today when strikebreakers, a labor organizer friend of mine once said that one easy way to break a strike is by instituting some anti-racist policy on the shop floor. You'll get the obvious reaction and it'll break the solidarity of the workers. So clearly that has a role to play.
Can you give an example of what that might look like?
Oh, they might open an office for diversity and inclusion. In fact, I think they do that on my campus in order to stave off unionizing in higher education. I mean, they'll do that. And it's really simple, right? And then you get people to form some kind of opinion on it. And once the opinion is being formed vis-a-vis the policy of the bosses, you're now there's a debate among the workers on the terrain of the boss's ideological attack. So you've lost already. I mean, and you could do this with religion. You could do this with nationality. You could do this in anything. I mean, look, speaking of co-optation of minorities, I'm a gay man in America. There is no white gay man in America. There's no group in the United States that's a minority, that's, an oppressed minority of some kind, that is more co-opted to everything from American imperialism to consumer culture to, I mean, you know.
It is so funny. I was having Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out. You can catch the live stream of This Is Revolution every Tuesday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Time and Saturday, 9 a.m. Pacific Time. This is Revolution.